Georgia was key to Biden pulling out the win, but the traditionally red state turned blue to help Biden win that state. How and why?
Democratic strategist Jennifer Holdsworth and Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Rachel Bovard, join us now to talk about that. Great to see you, ladies.
Good to see you guys.
Good to see you.
Good morning. So let me throw up on the screen this map that we have that can show you a little bit more detail in Georgia. This is from Nate Cohn over at the New York Times. So there was a lot of talk about Atlanta and about black turnout, but as it turns out, the story in Georgia looks like the story that played out across the country, which is that affluent white suburbs were the massive shift in this election towards Biden that handed him his margin of victory. In fact, the black share of the electorate in Georgia dropped, Jen, to its lowest level since 2006. So what do you make of those trends? Why do you think that we saw that result play out in the presidential election?
Well, I think this is why we as a party have a constant battle about messaging policy, right? You always hear it's, progressive versus moderate or centrist, right? And a lot of times that boils down not just to policy, but how you message that policy. There's a lot of folks in the party who are going to say, see, we were right. We ran a moderate candidate. We won back the suburbs. That's how we won this election. It's a little more complicated than that. That's part of the story. I think we also completely ignored the fact that Donald Trump had a very active and a very successful minority outreach program on his campaign. And for us as Democrats to just sit back and go, what? That's crazy. You must be a lunatic if you're a minority and vote for Donald Trump, right? No, because he was reaching out to them and he was saying, hey, these two parties have let you down for decades, centuries in America. You ought to try something new. And it was a successful argument. And if we don't confront that as a party, we're gonna be missing the vote.
What do you make of this, Rachel? Because there was a lot of talk. There's also a lot of takes on the Republican side, like, oh, well, we won over these minority voters, and so much more. And I think it's right, and I do plenty of dunking here about what the real coalition is that elected Joe Biden. What can the right learn possibly about this type of messaging and how their election should be run going forward, given just how tight that margin was?
Well, I'm still reeling from, I think, just the stunning reality of the fact that Donald Trump gained across the board, with minority voters, as you point out, Muslim voters, LGBTQ voters, and the fact that white suburban voters, white college educated suburban voters turned out for Joe Biden. It's like the Reagan coalition has flipped on its head.
Yeah,
the Democrat
right.
Party is now the party of white college educated voters, and Republicans are getting minority votes in an election where, again, Democrats for 4 years told minority bases that Donald Trump is a racist and hates them. And yet they still turned out in droves for him, which tells you something is different here. And to be honest, I think it should change the way the Republican Party does business in Washington, but also the way it talks to minority voters. Because the thing about Donald Trump, the guy doesn't pander. He just straight up tells you what he thinks. And I think a lot of people were responding to that authenticity in combination with a policy message that was economically focused on bread and butter issues instead of sort of woke identity politics. The Republican Party can learn from this and turn itself into a very powerful, durable, working class base. I'm not sanguine that it will. We tend to never learn anything.
Right there with
you.
But
we have a huge opportunity here that I'm still sort of getting my brain around because it's amazing.
Jen, do you think there'll be any reflection on the Democratic Party side based on these trends? I mean, I'm looking, part of the analysis they show, high-income areas became 7 points more Democratic. Majority college grad areas, 6 points more. Suburban areas, 6 points more. Majority age 65 plus, that's interesting, that is probably partly COVID, +5. Obama-Trump areas, +5. But in minority districts, they actually lost ground. More than 80% black, they lost ground to Donald Trump. Majority Hispanic lost ground to Donald Trump. And that's not only in an election where there was a lot of messaging about the racism of Donald Trump, the way his policies, on immigration in particular, extraordinarily extreme, but also where you had the first black female woman on presidential ticket, historic candidacy of Kamala Harris. And that seemed to fall flat with voters, if that was indeed the play, was to sort of juice minority turnout with this historic pick. Do you think there's any learnings or reflection that's actually going to happen in the Democratic Party on that? Or are they going to say, look, we won, so who cares?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to unpack there, right? First, there is no question that Donald Trump is, in fact, a racist, and he does, in fact, treat minorities very poorly, especially in terms of policy in this country. However, I actually give credit to the Biden campaign for running an economic first campaign. I think that there was a ton of pressure on VP Biden and his campaign manager, Jen O'Malley Dillon, to sort of change course as we were getting closer to Election Day and to talk about the quote unquote social issues, right? And they didn't do that. They were extremely disciplined. And I think that they deserve a lot of credit for not following,
let me push back on that in this way, which is that I actually think he was extraordinarily consistent, but I didn't see an economy first messaging. I saw the soul of the nation messaging, right? The first ad that he launched the Democratic primaries about Charlottesville, he closed out with restore the soul of the nation. I mean, he's very consistent about that messaging throughout. I actually didn't hear all that much leaning into an economic policy. The speech that he gave yesterday was the most explicit sort of prioritization of his economic priorities that I heard from the entire campaign.
I think that he focused on the economy almost entirely because anything he was talking about circled back to how people were doing in America. You know, I don't think it was a nuanced message at all. I think when he talked about coronavirus, not only did he talk about how obviously it's exploding still in the country, but he talked about the people that were left behind because this administration left them behind, right? So I think that everything was always hinged back. That doesn't mean that there wasn't a grand theme to the campaign. There absolutely was, and it was restoring the soul of the nation. But anytime he talked about the economy, the environment, it always circled back. So I actually think it was a really successful message. On the other hand, I do think that as a party, we constantly speak to different minority groups. And obviously I say this as a white cis woman who does not have experience in those communities. We constantly talk to them as a monolith, right? When we speak to the African-American community, what are we talking about? We're talking about criminal justice reform. When we talk to the Latino community, we're talking about immigration. When we're talking about women, we're talking about choice, right? That is the absolute wrong strategy to have when talking to people across the country. They are not a monolith. When you want to talk to Latino voters, talk to them about small businesses and faith and religion. You want to talk to the African-American community, talk to them about family, talk to them about jobs, talk to them about a lot of different issues. Democrats are terrible at that. Absolutely terrible.
It's funny, Rachel. Everything Jen is saying is basically what the Republican Party tried after 2012 with their little autopsy about, you know, how they have to speak to Latinos and to, you know, to African American voters and more. Is the autopsy dead, or are the people going to try and bring it back? What do you think?
I think they're going to try to bring it back because there's a consultant class that loves to be like, here's the card you read off of when you meet a Hispanic person. And we're never going to quite get away from that. But, you know, I think the flip side of that is I'm actually curious to the point that Crystal raised, if the Democrat Party is going to be allowed to sort of take that more authentic message, because you have this progressive wing of the party that's like, no, it's just about your lived experience. And, you know, there's nothing you can ever say that isn't about someone's race or gender. And so that's, I think, for the challenge for Democrats. The challenge for Republicans, again, is, just like not reading off the card, trying to be like a normal human that actually focuses on actual economic issues.
Well, there is a superseding challenge for both, which is the incredible dominance and influence that the donor class has in driving what they do and what they say. So on that very hopeful and optimistic note, ladies, always great to have your perspectives. Thank you very much.
Good to see you.
Next on Rising, in his new book, Barack Obama invokes the names of FDR and LBJ when talking about getting Obamacare passed. Ryan Grim is going to weigh in on that when Rising returns.